Rewind History with Josh Berry. Today we will be discussing Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass, from enslavement to national conscience. Frederick Douglass stands as one of the most important figures in American history because he transformed the experience of slavery into a powerful critique of the nation that sustained it. Born into bondage, denied formal education, and forced to live under the constant threat of violence, he did not emerge from slavery merely as a survivor. He emerged as a writer, speaker, organizer, and thinker whose voice would help define the struggle for abolition, citizenship, and civil rights in the United States. His life is remarkable not only because he escaped slavery, but because he used the freedom he won to challenge the moral foundations of slavery itself, and to demand that America live up to its own ideals. Early life in enslavement. Frederick Douglass was born in February 1818, probably on the eastern shore of Maryland. Like many enslaved people, he did not know his exact birth date, and even this basic fact with 122-521 was confirmed with that system. His father was likely a white man, though Douglass never knew his identity with certainty. From the beginning, then, his life was shaped by separation, uncertainty, and the brutal logic of slavery, which treated families as expendable and human beings as property. Douglass's mother was taken from him early in life, and he had little contact with her before her death. This separation was not incidental to slavery. It was part of its structure. Enslaved children were often removed from parents, sold away, or used to deepen the labor system's control over families. Douglass later described the pain of this estrangement as one of the cruelest features of slavery. The system did not merely exploit labor. It broke emotional bonds, erased kinship, and made human attachment itself vulnerable to the will of slaveholders. He spent his early years on plantations in Maryland before being sent to Baltimore as a young child. That move would prove crucial. In Baltimore, Douglass entered a new environment where he encountered ideas and experiences that began to awaken his sense of self. He lived in the household of Hugh and Sophia Auld. Sophia Auld began teaching him the alphabet, but Hugh quickly forbade it, declaring that education would make an enslaved person unfit for slavery. That statement had the opposite effect on Douglass. Instead of accepting the restriction, he understood it as proof that literacy was dangerous to the institution of slavery. If reading made a slave unmanageable, then learning to read became a path toward liberation. Douglass's hunger for education became one of the defining features of his youth. He learned what he could from white children in the neighborhood, exchanging small favors for reading lessons. He studied newspapers, copied letters, and sought out every opportunity to improve himself. This self-education was not simply an intellectual achievement. It was an act of resistance. By learning to read, Douglass began to interpret the world around him more clearly. He came to understand that slavery was not a natural condition, but a human-made system supported by law, custom, violence, and deception. Later, Douglass was sent to the countryside and placed under the control of Edward Covey, a man known for breaking enslaved people through relentless discipline and punishment. Covey tried to crush Douglass physically and psychologically. For a time, Douglass felt defeated and nearly lost hope, but then came one of the most famous moments in his life. He fought back. When Covey attempted to whip him, Douglass resisted, and the struggle marked a turning point in his self-understanding. He later described that confrontation as a moment when his sense of manhood returned. It did not end slavery, but it restored his inner will to resist it. That moment matters because it reveals something essential about Douglass's life and thought. Resistance for him began before freedom became visible. He was already refusing the mental logic of slavery. He was already asserting that he was a person with dignity, agency, and moral worth. This inner rebellion would later become the foundation of his public life. Escape from slavery Douglass's escape from slavery was carefully planned and deeply dangerous. In 1838, he fled Maryland by disguising himself as a sailor and using borrowed papers to travel north. He relied on courage, timing, and help from others, especially Anna Murray, a free black woman from Baltimore, who would later become his wife. The escape was not a simple flight into freedom. It was a perilous journey through a country in which slavery's reach extended far beyond the plantation. Fugitive slaves could be pursued, captured, and returned, even in free states. And at every stage, Douglass risked discovery. When he arrived in New York City, he was legally free in one sense, but his life was still unstable. He had money, no real protection, and the constant danger of being seized and returned to bondage. His freedom had to be defended as well as won. Anna Murray's support was crucial. Their marriage soon followed, and the couple settled in New Bedford, Massachusetts. There, he adopted the surname Douglass, a name that helped establish his new public identity and symbolize his separation from the enslaved past that had defined his birth.
In New Bedford, Douglass began to build a life in freedom, but he did not leave slavery behind in silence. Instead, he carried his experience into the public sphere.
He worked ordinary labor jobs, joined a free black community, and came into contact with abolitionist networks that recognized the extraordinary force of his story. He was soon asked to speak about his experiences, and what began as local testimony became a national and eventually international career. His escape from slavery was not the end of his story. It was the beginning of his public mission. Abolitionist leadership. Frederick Douglass entered the abolitionist movement at a moment when the nation was increasingly divided over slavery, but he did not become merely one voice among many. He became one of the movement's most powerful figures because he combined lived experience, intellectual discipline, and extraordinary rhetorical skill. When he spoke about slavery, he did so as someone who had known its violence firsthand. That gave his words an authority few could match. His early abolitionist work was connected to the reform circles of Massachusetts, where he encountered William Lloyd Garrison and other leading anti-slavery activists. Garrison and Douglass initially worked closely together, and Douglass embraced the abolitionist belief that slavery was a moral evil that had to be destroyed. But as his own political thinking matured, he developed a more independent position. He came to believe that abolition required not just moral persuasion, but political action, constitutional argument, and direct engagement with the structures of power. That independence was crucial. Douglass was never content to be someone else's symbol. He listened, learned, and debated. He knew that freedom demanded not just eloquence, but strategy. In time, he moved away from Garrison's distrust of politics and toward a broader political vision that recognized the importance of law, voting rights, and federal action. This shift reflected Douglass's growing realism. He understood that slavery was protected by institutions, and institutions could not be defeated by rhetoric alone. One of the most important developments in his career was his work as a lecturer. He traveled widely across the North, speaking before anti-slavery audiences and confronting racist assumptions directly. White audiences were often astonished by his intelligence, discipline, and command of language. Some had expected an uneducated former slave. Instead, they encountered a thinker of great seriousness and precision. Douglass used that shock strategically. He showed, by his very presence, that slavery's logic of racial inferiority was false. In 1845, he published Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave, a book that made him famous far beyond abolitionist circles. The autobiography was both a personal testimony and a political weapon. It exposed slavery's brutality in vivid, concrete detail, while also proving that an enslaved black man could produce a sophisticated, and powerful written work.
The narrative is one of the great texts of American literature because it is at once intimate and public, painful and analytical, deeply personal and broadly political.
Douglass also became a newspaper editor, founding and editing the North Star, one of the most influential black anti-slavery newspapers in the United States. Through journalism, he extended his influence beyond the lecture hall and into the wider public sphere. He wrote about slavery, freedom, race, politics, and religion, and he did so with clarity and force. His paper became a vehicle for black thought and black political leadership at a time when black voices were routinely marginalized or ignored. What made Douglass such an effective abolitionist was not only his condemnation of slavery, but his ability to describe what freedom should look like. He did not ask simply for an end to bondage. He demanded education, citizenship, political power, dignity, and equal opportunity. In that sense, he was not merely an abolitionist. He was a theorist of democracy. He understood that a nation could not claim moral authority while denying rights to millions of its inhabitants. The power of his writings. Douglass's writings are among the most significant in American history because they do more than recount events. They interpret them. In Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, he wrote with remarkable discipline and force, exposing slavery as a system designed to destroy family, identity, and autonomy. The book begins with the uncertainty of his birth and moves through scenes of deprivation, violence, and a weakening. It is not a sentimental memoir. It is an argument. One of the most striking features of the narrative is its attention to literacy. Douglass presents reading as a form of liberation because it gives him access to ideas that slavery tries to keep hidden. He learns that slavery is defended through lies, religious hypocrisy, and legal power. The more he reads, the more he sees the contradiction between American ideals and American practice. Literacy does not simply inform him, it radicalizes him. It helps him name the injustice he already feels. The book is also powerful because of the way Douglass uses his own life to speak for others. He never pretends that his experience was unique in its suffering. Instead, he presents it as representative of slavery's broader violence. This makes the autobiography larger than one man's story. It becomes evidence. It says, in effect, that this is what slavery does to human beings. This is what it steals, and this is why it must end. His later writings continued this same pattern of directness and political insight. Douglass wrote speeches, essays, editorials, and revised autobiographical accounts across his life. He never stopped thinking about freedom, race, and the meaning of citizenship. As his career progressed, his writing became more politically sophisticated, but it retained its moral urgency. He could speak plainly about injustice while also analyzing the deeper forces behind it. The importance of Douglass's writings lies not only in their content, but in their existence. In a society that denied literacy and public authorship to enslaved black people, his literary success was itself a challenge to white supremacy. He proved that black intellect could not be contained or dismissed. He made language a weapon of liberation. Civil War and Reconstruction. When the Civil War began, Douglass recognized it as a turning point in the struggle against slavery. He had long argued that the country could not avoid the slavery question forever, and now the conflict made that question unavoidable. For Douglass, the war was not just about preserving the Union. It was about whether the Union deserved to survive in a form that tolerated human bondage. He wanted the war to become a war for emancipation, and he pushed the federal government to move in that direction. One of Douglass's most important wartime causes was the enlistment of black soldiers. He argued that black men should be allowed to fight for the Union because military service would demonstrate their loyalty, courage, and citizenship. He believed that black participation in the war effort would help prove that African Americans were not merely passive recipients of freedom, but active defenders of the nation. This was not just a tactical argument, it was a moral one. If black men could fight and die for the Union, then the nation had no excuse for denying them equality. Douglass also met with Abraham Lincoln and influenced national policy through his advocacy. Their relationship was not simple. Douglass was often frustrated by Lincoln's caution, especially early in the war, when the administration seemed hesitant to confront slavery directly. But he came to respect Lincoln's political judgment and his movement toward emancipation. Their interactions symbolized the larger relationship between black activism and federal power. Douglass pushed, challenged, and pressed the government to do more than it otherwise might have done. The end of the war created new questions rather than resolving old ones. Reconstruction raised the issue of what freedom would actually mean in practice. Douglass understood that slavery's destruction did not automatically create equality. Former slaveholders, racist lawmakers, and white supremacist violence all threatened to limit the meaning of emancipation. For that reason, Douglass became one of the strongest advocates for black suffrage, civil rights, and federal protection during Reconstruction. He believed that freedom without political power was incomplete. Black Americans needed the vote, legal rights, access to institutions, and protection from violence if emancipation was to have real substance. He warned that if the country abandoned black citizens after slavery ended, it would betray the very principles for which the war had supposedly been fought. That warning proved painfully prescient in the years that followed, as Reconstruction was gradually undermined and white supremacy reasserted itself in new forms. Douglass's analysis of Reconstruction was rooted in both hope and realism. He wanted the United States to become a genuinely democratic nation, but he never underestimated the resistance such a transformation would face. He understood that freedom had to be defended politically, legally, and morally.
The end of slavery was not the end of the struggle. Legacy in American history and civil rights. Frederick Douglass's legacy is enormous because he helped shape the language of freedom in America. He did not merely oppose slavery.
He developed a way of thinking and speaking about democracy that continues to matter. He insisted that freedom must be real, not symbolic, equal, not partial, defended, not assumed. That principle connects his 19th century struggle to later civil rights movements and to modern debates about justice and citizenship. One of the most enduring aspects of his legacy is his defense of black intellectual and political authority. Douglass proved that a black man could not only survive slavery, but also become one of the most incisive critics of the nation that had enslaved him. He showed that black thought was not marginal, but central to the American democratic experiment. His life challenged racist assumptions about intellect, leadership, and public voice. In doing so, he created a model for later generations of black writers, activists, and leaders. He also left behind a powerful example of self-fashioning. Douglass was born without control over his name, family, labor, or future. Yet he transformed himself into a public figure of national importance. He claimed authorship of his own story and used that story to expose the larger structures of oppression around him. That act of self-definition remains inspiring because it shows how identity can become a site of resistance. Douglass's influence on civil rights is especially important because he understood that rights must be enforced, not merely declared. He knew that laws alone do not guarantee justice. Institutions, political will, and public pressure are also necessary. This insight would echo through later struggles for voting rights, desegregation, fair treatment under the law, and equal participation in public life. Douglass saw the limits of paper freedom long before later generations gave those problems new names. His legacy also endures because he remains useful for understanding the contradictions of American history. He loved the promise of the nation even as he condemned its failures. He held the United States to account by measuring it against its own claims. That balance of criticism and commitment gives his writing extraordinary force. Many people are not interested in tearing America down for its own sake. He wanted to make it better, truer, and more just. Even now, Douglass speaks to questions that remain unresolved. What does freedom require? Who gets to belong? What does equality mean in practice? How should a nation respond to the harm it has caused? Douglass's life does not answer these questions once and for all, but it gives a powerful framework for asking them.
That is one reason his voice still feels urgent. Conclusion. Frederick Douglass's life matters because he turned suffering into testimony, and testimony into action. He escaped slavery, but he did not stop at personal freedom.
He made his life a struggle for the liberation of others and for the transformation of the nation itself. Through his writings, speeches, journalism, and political advocacy, he exposed the brutality of slavery and insisted on the full humanity of Black Americans. His early life revealed the cruelty of bondage. His escape showed courage and strategic intelligence. His abolitionist leadership helped turn anti-slavery sentiment into political force. His writings, especially narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, an American slave, remain among the clearest indictments of slavery ever produced. His role during the Civil War and Reconstruction demonstrated that freedom without rights is incomplete, and his legacy continues to shape American conversations about democracy, race, and citizenship. Few figures in American history have spoken with such moral clarity or lived with such purpose. Douglass understood that history is not only inherited, it is contested. He spent his life contesting it. In doing so, he helped define what it means to fight for a more just America.